Order, order. I'd like to remind members that there have been some changes to normal practice in order to support the new call list system and to ensure that social distancing can be respected. Members should sanitise their microphones using the cleaning materials provided before they use them and respect the one-way system around the room. Members should speak only from the horseshoe. Members can only speak if they are on the call lists. This applies even if debates are undersubscribed. Members cannot join the debate if they are not on the call list. Members are not expected to remain for wind-ups. Members in the latter stages of the call list should use the seats in the public gallery and move onto the horseshoe when seats become available. That's when there are more than 10 speakers. I remind honourable members as well that there is less of an expectation that members stay for the next two speeches once they have spoken. This is to help manage attendance in the room. Members may wish to stay beyond their speech, but they should be aware that in doing so, they may prevent members in the seats in the public gallery from moving to seats in the horseshoe. Some of that is redundant because we've got nobody in the public gallery at the present time. Order. Tonia Antoniazzi to move the motion.
It is an honour to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Stringer. I beg to move that this House has considered e-petitions 306773 and 320772 relating to exams during Covid-19. Now, this debate has been triggered by two petitions. Firstly, a petition started by Jakir Ali to review the decision to use previous data to calculate exam grades, which has 148,880 signatures, and then Rafia Hussein's petition to reduce the curriculum content for Year 10 and 12 students who will sit exams in 2021 with 147,099 signatures. This is indeed a very timely debate to be held today in light of the government's written statement. And in what has been a very worrying time for everyone, and despite the furore over the summer about exam results, many students still feel like they have been abandoned in this crisis. At the outset, I want to put on record my thanks to all the students, parents and teachers who have had to deal with this unprecedented situation. Students have shown a resilience that has surprised many and dealt with the impact of Covid-19 better than the majority of adults I know. But having been a teacher myself, this hasn't surprised me, but I am proud of them all nonetheless. But from now on, we must make sure that our students, our future generations, are properly supported in their efforts. Since my name was announced as leading on this debate, I have had a number of students get in touch with me about how this uncertainty is affecting their mental health. And this issue has much wider impacts for many of them. It could affect their entire life. Having spoken to the authors of these two petitions, listening to teachers and students about this, and drawing on my own experience as a teacher, I believe that clarity is paramount for everyone involved. We have had today an announcement from the government, which I will believe do nothing to allay the fears of more students, parents and teachers. This government are keen to say that they are levelling up the country, but this debacle has shown that they are not interested in helping the most disadvantaged pupils throughout this, and that is what I find most striking. All students have lost 5 months of in-school teaching, and as we know, it will not, many of those have not had access to the internet or IT. There have been efforts to, address this, but it hasn't reached everybody. And those 5 months missed of school will now be given 3 weeks of extra time. I mean, I can hear the guffaws of my teacher friends from Wigan from this very place. And as we face further uncertainty from a second wave of Covid, these disadvantages could be further exacerbated. Far from levelling up, this is treading down students who don't have all the advantages afforded to them of 2/3 of the cabinet that went to private school. Unlike the UK Government, the Welsh Government has commissioned an independent review into what happened with exams over the summer, and they will look at what improvements can be made for next year. When the A-level results came out in the summer and students and families were rightly upset, all I could think of as a parent of a child awaiting GCSE results was that it didn't have to be like this. Where was the debate? Where were the conversations with students, teachers and parents? There was none, if very little. And the views of the unions were readily ridiculed and silenced by those who have no idea what it is like to teach in a comprehensive school system. But I would like to thank both of those behind these important petitions, Jakia Ali and Rafia Hussain. The sheer number of signatures on both of these petitions demonstrates the strength of feeling across the country about this issue. Jakia started the petition in March, and it was great to speak to such an eloquent and determined young woman who was meant to be sitting her GCSEs this summer as well, like my son. And she felt the stress and the frustration firsthand, and I can relate to that. Moreover, Jakia had little to focus on when she knew that there would be no exams, and she had a long wait until her A-level started. But what is notable about her petition, and it was indeed on A-level results day that it gathered momentum, a true reflection of how unhappy young people were. She was worried and concerned about how her results would be calculated, and understandably wanted to ensure that she and her friends received grades that reflected their true potential, because isn't that what we want for all of our children? When I spoke to Rafia, herself a teacher, we found that we had quite a lot in common. Last week, she still felt that the government was doing nothing. Her experiences through remote learning, she said she found very difficult to engage with her learners. And that was the experience of many of her fellow teachers, because we know it is not the same as face-to-face learning. And she had first experience of that, especially with a family member who was in year 10. And this had a huge impact on his self-esteem and engagement with the GCSE curriculum. Rafia set this petition up in the early hours of the morning, frustrated and feeling that this was the way the government would hear her call, for the petition to be debated and for the government to put into action an action plan to reduce the content of GCSE and A-levels so that students would be able to achieve their full potential in a limited time. The hard fact is, as the NEU have stated, the only route to fairness would be a complete cancellation of exams and the use of robustly moderated, externally quality-assured teacher judgment, because it is the teacher judgment that is what we relied on this year. I found it very, very difficult with all of my friends in the teaching profession, listening to them, hearing their concerns, not just in England, but in Wales as well. They need to be listened to. This is my plea. This is the plea of the petitioners. Listen to the people at the chalk face. Listen to the teachers, the pupils, students at GCSE and A-level, and have their voice. For them to have their voices heard is very, very important. This is why I'm proud to stand here and to talk to these petitions, because petitions give people a voice. The government can do more and should do more and should be listening to them. Thank you, Mr Stringer.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 306773 and 320772 relating to exams during Covid-19. There's no SNP spokesperson, so I intend to call the two front bench speakers at 20 minutes before the end, which is 20 to 6. So they get 10 minutes. There's 10 other speakers, so you can divide that up yourselves. Hugh Merriman.
Mr Stringer, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak in this debate. Having not done too well in my maths, I'm struggling to work out how much time I have got, but I shan't take all of the allotted time in any event. And can I also just say it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Gower with her wide-ranging speech and introduction to this e-petition debate as we rightly discuss the impact on exams from COVID. And I want to touch on my speech with regard to the cohort that have just been through their GCSEs and A-levels without sitting exams, or many of them won't. And also, I think, to look to the future and look at the current cohort and what may be the right thing for them in the circumstance. And of course, when I look at the current years that are about to take their exams, I'm very mindful of the written statement that has come from the Department of Education today that has announced that exams will be put back by 3 weeks, and also some talk as to other changes. And I would like to ask the Minister perhaps to tease out a little more information from that written statement, so in his answer we can perhaps hear a little more. But if I can first of all start with regard to those pupils that have just had, quite frankly, a miserable time in the last 6 months of their either GCSE or their A-levels. In fact, indeed, all pupils have been impacted. But for those that were unable to sit the exams that they've worked so hard for, I am incredibly sympathetic and empathetic for what they've gone through. They had geared themselves up with the support of their teachers and, of course, those loved ones around them to take their big test, and to find that they were unable to do so was heartbreaking for all concerned. I know there has been a lot of talk and discussion with hindsight in terms of how things could have been done differently, and I'm sure it will come up again. All I would say to that regard is that I'm very conscious that there was a decision from the Conservative government in England, a decision from the SNP government in Scotland, the Labour government in Wales, and the DUP Sinn Féin government in Northern Ireland, and it was not that different. I think every single department has had to really wrestle with what's right in the circumstances in a very fast-changing situation, and I'm certainly mindful of that, and I'm grateful for all of the nation's departments and what they've done. But the reality is that those young people have, in certain regards, missed out. And I'd say this in particular, which is why I want to talk about the importance of exams. For some people, exams are the way that they are best able to demonstrate their aptitude and their ability to have absorbed. And for those young people that would have not been able to sit exams or haven't sat the exams, and those exams would have given them better grades than perhaps their teacher-reflected grades would have given them, then those young people have missed out. And I stand here as someone that's in that exact situation, having got very poor GCSEs and went to a further education college, not the private elite education that the honourable member may have referred to in my regards, but I'm not in the cabinet. Maybe there's a linkage there, the correlation. But having attended a secondary modern school, so failed my 12 plus, and then gone through to a further education college where my grades were effectively rather lazily based on my GCSEs, assuming that I hadn't been taught anything during the A-level 2 years. It was a surprise to everyone, not least me, when A's came out. So I had to start again and actually reapply to universities that perhaps I should have applied to in the first place. That only occurred because I took my exams. And so there will be other younger people out there. I'm not suggesting the teaching quality is as it was decades ago when I was in that situation. But there will be many young people who will have missed out on a great place at university or somewhere else they'd want to go because they didn't have the opportunity to take an exam. They may have had the fallback, but let's be honest, who was going to take that in the circumstances? So I absolutely applaud the determination to have exams back on the timetable for 2021, and I think that's absolutely right for us to do so. What I would say, though, to the Minister is my concern at how much time has now been lost by those who will be sitting their GCSE and A-level exams. Arguably, they've missed out more of their content than those who would have sat exams in the year just gone, because coming into March, they pretty much finished their content for the 2 years. This cohort have lost a good 6-month chunk, in my view, and I'm very concerned. And I would like to see us reflect on whether the syllabus and the content can be changed to take that into account. It's fine to say we're giving an extra 3 weeks, but that does not correlate to the months that were lost, and I feel that would be right. I understand that geography has been looked at in terms of field trips not going ahead, English literature in terms of the reading, but I believe other subjects have not been looked at, and I would ask the Minister if that can be done on a subject-per-subject basis and a report given back after this half-term is ended, because schools and pupils need that clarity. And the other thing I would just like to ask the Minister is to take into account coursework. If we do go down the road, which we hope we won't, where schools are not able to take their exams again, then we're looking at schools on an individual school-by-school basis. and question whether it would be better to have some marked coursework by the exam boards so there is some rigour and consistency of standards should we fall back to a place that we don't want to fall back to, which is no exams. But by and large, I would just like to say, and I'll end there, Mr Stringer, so that there is time for the Minister to respond, that I welcome the statement today from the Government. I welcome the fact that there is a recommitment to exams. The few weeks will be very well received, but I would also ask if we can go a bit deeper and look again at the syllabus content to make sure that those young people that have missed out quite a large chunk of their A-levels and GCSEs are not disadvantaged when it comes to getting their grades. Thank you.
DC.
Thank you very much. Mr Stringer, it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and a privilege to be taking part in this important debate, very ably led, may I say by my honourable friend, the member for Gower, which has been triggered by a summer of chaos in our schools and colleges. Hundreds of people in my Slough constituency have signed both petitions showing real concern and anger amongst the people that I represent. Like every honourable member here, over the summer I was contacted by parents, teachers and young people themselves about their concerns and the confusion and chaos surrounding this year's exam results. Heartbreaking stories of university places withdrawn and futures stolen. I think even the government's greatest supporters would acknowledge that things did not go well. In March, the Education Secretary cancelled exams, saying this year's students should not face, and I quote, systematic disadvantage as a consequence of these extraordinary circumstances. In July, the Education Select Committee sounded the alarm that groups of pupils, especially those from disadvantaged and Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, would be penalised. On the 13th of August, those awarded A or A star at A-level increased to an all-time high in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, with 27.9% securing top grades, and I congratulate them all. However, pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds were hit hardest by the algorithm, with Ofqual itself showing that disadvantaged pupils were most likely to have the grades proposed by their teachers overruled and downgraded, and children from affluent backgrounds most likely to do well. And the same pattern a few days later with the GCSEs. So whilst ministers started the summer saying they wanted to avoid systematic disadvantage, by the end of the summer it was plain ministers were responsible for the exact opposite, hard-baking disadvantage into the system. And where was the Prime Minister? Like McCavity, the mystery cat, the Prime Minister's not there. And a report by the National Foundation for Educational Research last month revealed that school pupils were on average 3 months behind where they would normally be without the lockdown, with more deprived students and schools worst affected. I have a rather famous top school near me, down near Slough in Windsor. But, Mr Stringer, why should pupils at that particular college get enhanced opportunity on top of the huge opportunities that they already have at the expense of pupils at Wexham School, Beechwood School, Ditton Park Academy or other such great schools within Slough? It is especially cruel to get pupils who have worked so hard and were on track to do well, but simply due to attending a school which historically had struggled, they were punished. And as the Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union, Mary Bousted, said, grades were initially awarded for the vast majority of students with no reference to or evidence of their individual achievements. Mr Stringer, we tell people that their children can do better than they did. We tell the next generation that if they work hard, they can get on. If we as a society break that fundamental promise, we risk far more than one summer of chaos. We risk a breakdown of trust in our institutions and a generation held back by injustice. We are storing up troubles for decades to come. The petitioners point to 2 key areas where we can try to get it right next year. Firstly, to review in forensic detail what went wrong this summer, despite the warnings from education unions, from schools and from the Select Committee, and secondly, to make plans and give much needed clarity for those who are taking exams next year. I'm glad the government have addressed the exams timetable for 2021, but since August, the Labour Party have been calling for exams to be delayed till June to give pupils more time to catch up on lost teaching time. And it's unacceptable that it's taken only until today, over a month after schools returned, for the government to finally commit to doing this. Until now, parents, pupils and schools have been left in the dark regarding the timing of exams, making it more difficult for them to plan for the academic year. Additionally, while a delay to exams is necessary, other measures must also be considered by the government to ensure that exams are fair. So perhaps the Minister can address the following 3 points. Firstly, what guarantees can he give parents, pupils and teachers in Slough schools that we won't see a 2021 summer of chaos? Secondly, what measures will ministers put into place to ensure pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds do not have their dreams stolen by hardwired injustice? And finally, what can the Minister tell the House about thousands of taxpayer pounds going to PR agency Public First, paid by Ofqual this summer to clear up their public relations disaster? Public First, Mr Stringer, a PR agency run by Rachel Wolfe and James Frayne, former special advisers to the Right Honourable Member for Surrey Heath, on a contract awarded without competitive tender. Does the Minister consider that this is a good use of public money? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr Stringer. It's a pleasure serving your chairmanship. And before I start, the Honourable Lady for Gower opened the debate was talking about those who attended a private school education. As someone who received that, I'm certainly not going to apologise for a school that my parents thought was best for me to attend at the time when the 2 state schools nearby me were both sadly failing and one on the verge of closure. And before other members sort of chastise me, some sort of Tory toff, it would be interesting to know my backstory maybe before they wish to sign that tag to me without making lazy assumption. I will not. So the reaction on what we saw was quite simple with Ofqual. Ofqual saw what was coming down the road. Why? Because I'm a member of the Education Select Committee, where we made it very clear on the 11th of July in our published report, when taking evidence, what the situation was, which was where you had large cohorts, kids would be disadvantaged, where you had disadvantaged children within those large cohorts who were high achievers, but were in low achieving schools, they would see their grades brought down as well, and SEND schools with small cohorts and variable results year on year would also see an impact. So Ofqual had notice of what we thought was going to go wrong. And sadly, it appears that Ofqual chose to not heed the advice of the Education Select Committee in this regard. What even annoyed me even further, Mr Stringer, was that when I was on the Education Select Committee with the chair of Ofqual after the A-level and GCSE results fiasco, we saw very clearly that when I put it to the chair and asked him, did he run a data set after what happened in Scotland on the 4th of August to see how results would be impacting this country, it was dodging and skirting from him. So there was no answer to the fact that they chose at no stage to actually look at their data analytically enough to determine whether or not they were going to see a good outcome, especially when the algorithm itself, I am led to believe, was not shown to ministers for an awfully long period of time. It certainly wasn't shared with the Education Select Committee and certainly wasn't published again, despite numerous people wishing to take part. In fact, to the point where we saw an outside agency offering their services in order to engage with this particular, looking at the algorithm, and sadly that was turned down. It was the Royal Statistical Society, sorry, Mr Stringer. 2 fellows were blocked from joining the Ofqual Technical Advisory Group and of independent experts, even though they wished to advise. So Ofqual, again, have answers that they need to give on that regard. I would also agree that whilst, in places like Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Talk that I'm proud to represent, and seeing some of the emails coming in from young people who work tremendously hard and were unable to leave school in the normal traditional way of having a leavers assembly, being able to get the recognition they deserved, I was deeply disappointed. I will not, unfortunately. But I will go back on to Ofqual again, where Tim Oates from the Cambridge Assessments Group, the Director of Research, brought up that he raised with the Secretary of State and Minister Gibb, and who he said, we're eager to hear about the problems the organisation uncovered with regards to the algorithm. And sadly, when it was raised with Ofcol raised it with a shrug off of basically, we're not interested to hear from anyone outside. So Ofcol have lost that confidence of the education sector. And as someone who was also a former secondary school teacher in state schools for 8 years across London and in Birmingham, I can only imagine the pain teachers felt when they saw their hard work of ranking students, which my partner, who's the head of religious education, did 8.5 hours of ranking students was simply ignored because of the size of the cohort, which I don't think was good enough. So the lessons must be learnt, Minister, from Germany, where they did sit exams, where they saw their results actually fall in line with previous years or even slightly exceeding. Exams are an absolute must. But for two young ladies in my constituency, before I finish, they would like to know, Minister, very clearly that what is expected of them in terms of the curriculum and in terms of the exam content they will face, because they feel that whilst those 3 weeks are very welcome, 6 months of face-to-face contact was lost, and that is obviously awfully damaging to them. And I beg you, Minister, to make sure that Ofcol do not go to an online model, which they mentioned on the Select Committee, because I do believe that that will only end up in a disaster yet again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Stringer, and it's a pleasure to speak in this debate. And as someone who went to a tough South East London comprehensive, big on pastoral care, but not so big on academic results, I'm pretty sure that I wouldn't have been graded my 3 A's by the algorithm, and that my life would have taken a very different path if I had been graded in 2020. So this is an issue that I feel very strongly about. Mr Stringer, the pandemic has presented schools with a range of complex problems, but schools up and down the country, not least in my constituency, did a brilliant job staying open for key workers and vulnerable children, providing lessons for homeschooling and preparing for September's wider reopening. However, the summer exams fiasco, the failure to get an adequate testing system in place and a complete lack of specific guidance for schools has made it apparent that our schools are being let down by the government. I recently invited all the head teachers in my constituency to a virtual meeting to discuss the current situation and to listen to their concerns. And one of the most pressing issues that they raised was clarity and guidance around how exams will be conducted this academic year. It is a completely acceptable demand of theirs, and it's staggering it has taken the government until today to respond to this, particularly given what's happened over the summer. And whilst today's announcement of a 3-week postponement is necessary, it doesn't do anything to make up for a term or more of missed classes. It also doesn't recognise or solve the problem that students have been disrupted by the pandemic to varying degrees, with those that have been impacted the most by coronavirus being at the greatest disadvantage. More needs to be done to take this into consideration and make this year's exams fairer. Pupils set to sit these exams are in the final stages of Year 10 and Year 12 when schools closed in March. As a result, they've missed out on months of face-to-face learning. In addition to this, the wide range of safety measures in schools, the risks of periods of self-isolation and other external disruptions are preventing teaching as usual for now. Further, there's the possibility that the development of the pandemic could prevent many from physically sitting the exams of summer 2021. At these difficult times, we look to the government to set direction and bring a degree of certainty to the uncertain. But it's taken until today to get an answer, and yet questions and uncertainty still remain. This uncertainty doesn't help anyone. We should not underestimate the impact of lockdown on young people's mental health, and the pandemic has further exacerbated inequalities already in society. Schools need to be able to focus on pastoral care and support after many months out of the classroom. And indeed, a recent survey by the charity Parent Kind found that 88% of parents surveyed thought the lack of clarity about arrangements for exams had negatively affected their child's mental health or well-being. Among the remaining questions omitted from today's announcement are how the exams will ensure pupils who have faced different levels of disruption will be treated equally, what the contingency plans might actually be should future lockdowns occur, and if so, what information should schools now be gathering in case exams are cancelled again and grades have to be estimated. Serious consideration also has to be given to the impact that self-isolation of pupils and teachers will have, given the issues schools have told me about the lack of access to tests. 5 education unions, including the NEU and the NAHT, have put forward a detailed proposal to help remedy these problems. They suggest mechanisms such as reducing the content in qualifications or introducing greater optionality where students can choose to answer questions on, for example, 3 out of 5 possible topics. This would help that grades received are as fair as possible and recognise the different experiences pupils may have had over the year. The proposal also suggests contingency plans so that students that are impacted by the pandemic significantly will still be able to receive a fair grade. Suggestions include reserve papers for students unable to sit exams on a particular date but able to sit them shortly afterwards, and staged assessments before the summer exams, which could then be used if these exams have to be abandoned altogether. I hope that today we can get clarity from the Minister and his department, and that they will be discussing with schools and unions going forward how best to design the summer exam system. The government's approach to negotiations with the unions about the wider reopening of schools was wholly lacking. I hope they do not make the same mistake again when it comes to exams. I do not doubt the scale of this challenge, but given the department's recent performance and the lack of urgency it has treated this issue with, it is more important than ever that the department engages with schools and unions. By doing so, I believe a fair system can be delivered that will give young people who have already been impacted so much by this pandemic a fair chance at future attainment. But it requires the government to listen and to work with all those involved.
Peacock.
Mr Stringer, it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and it is of course a great pleasure to follow my honourable friend. As many colleagues have mentioned, the impact of the results scandal is still being felt by young people across the country. Students who felt their life chances had been changed through no fault of their own, parents who spent hours on hold waiting to speak to someone in a university admissions office, and teachers who felt ignored by this government and powerless to help their hard-working students. Back in August, when the A-level results were published, I received correspondence from many angry constituents who had their results downgraded by the government-approved algorithm. Barnsley College, which serves my constituency, said that overall 63% of pupils were downgraded against teacher predictions. This was in sharp contrast to pupils in more affluent areas and those that were in private education, whose grades were reported to have risen overall. And this is the point that the gentleman opposite, despite his private education, seems to have missed. Fortunately, the pressure that followed led to a government U-turn. But young people in Barnsley East and across the country should never have been subjected to such an injustice, which in turn led to so much uncertainty regarding their university places and next steps. The government's mishandling of this whole fiasco was nothing short of disastrous. Young people and their families were put through days of anxiety and uncertainty just because our Prime Minister and his Education Secretary were too stubborn to accept that using their algorithm was unfair and discriminatory. Teachers reported to me at the time they were left feeling undervalued and ignored after their predicted grades were overruled. I accept that these are unprecedented times, but this should never have been allowed to happen, and I fully support calls for an investigation into what went wrong and how to ensure this is never repeated. However, any investigation should take place alongside planning for exams in 2021. Our Year 11 and 13 GCSE, BTEC and A-level students are currently facing enormous pressure. They are trying to cram the lost 6 months of learning into an already crammed curriculum. Unless there is a rethink, they will have to complete up to 80 months of work in 9 short months if they are to have any chance of following their desired education or career paths. I fully support the move to get students back into the classroom, but the government has to acknowledge that this is so different to any other academic year, and the calls for our teachers for a rethink in how exams take place this year should not be ignored. As we realised in August's fiasco, no one is better placed than our teachers on the front line to judge what will happen if the government fail to step in and make the required changes before we hurtle headlong into another educational catastrophe. Pupil attendance is already significantly lower than previous years, mainly due to bubbles collapsing, pupils isolating suspected and confirmed COVID cases, and rising anxieties and mental health challenges. Teachers are reporting fatigue as never felt before in October due to the stress of managing health and safety of themselves and their pupils and the added workload. But one of the most important factors in all of this, one that the government appears to have completely overlooked, is the disparity between pupils from affluent areas versus their less affluent neighbours. Young people from more deprived areas are more likely to do worse in 2021 exams if the government doesn't step in with a sustainable and fair plan. As many schools and colleges start to move back online learning, it has to be acknowledged how this disproportionately affects pupils who might not have the internet in their homes, don't have access to a laptop, or simply have a chaotic home life that finding a quiet space to work is almost impossible. While I welcome the government scheme to provide laptops for disadvantaged children, this doesn't go anywhere near far enough to ensure that no student or young people misses out on vital learning as a result of this crisis. There are many students who are outside the government criteria for eligibility, who will simply fall through the cracks if the scheme isn't extended. In July, it was reported that 80% of private schools were offering a full online suite of lessons, in contrast to just 8% of state schools. The outcome of this pandemic cannot be one where the richest survive. Steps must be taken to equalise the life chances of all that are due to take exams next summer. I pay tribute to the hard work of teachers across Barnsley East and across the whole of the UK. These are unprecedented times, and as such, they call for unprecedented measures. The government must listen to the professionals and act quickly to ensure the class of 2021 do not have their life chances reduced.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and also to contribute in a debate where we have the wonderful leadership of the member for Gower, who was a teacher herself, but also, members may not be aware, is an excellent rugby player. And for that, I think we can all be grateful. Mr. Stringer, it's never easy waiting for exam results, but for the children and the young people of Hornsey and Wood Green, they spent their summer waiting for the results of exams they never sat, determined by algorithms designed by someone who'd never seen their work, and it's been particularly challenging. Everyone accepts that setting grades was difficult in these unique circumstances, yet the Education Secretary had 5 months to prepare, and it wasn't as if warnings were not flagged. As has already been mentioned in today's debate, this report by the Education Select Committee went into quite a lot of detail, saying that pupils will carry these qualifications with them for their entire lives. Their calculated grades must be accurate, but we have concerns that the system described by Ofqual as the fairest possible in the circumstances could be unfair for groups, including disadvantaged pupils, BAME pupils, children looked after, and pupils with SEND. And never was a truer word spoken, and yet all that hard work which members of this House put into the Select Committee report appears to have been completely ignored. While the Prime Minister was holidaying in a wigwam, I joined the local students in Parliament Square in their fight for justice. Many I spoke to were distraught, terrified that they'd lost their university places through no fault of their own, and unable to believe that they'd been given grades for lower than anything they'd ever received throughout their education. Ludicrously, some students got a U as though they'd never been there, a U which related to a student from the year before at their particular school. The 20% figure which I've been given by my local mental health trust relates to the increase in demand on mental health services, which is predominantly going to fall onto the shoulders of our young people. Not only are we not prepared at that level, we don't seem to be prepared at the educational level at all as well. We need to start predicting the dreadful outcomes of this COVID now and start preparing for the mental health needs of the next generation, because they, to me, appear to be like the First World War generation, shell-shocked, traumatised and in desperate need of comfort and support. Now, eventually the U-turn did come, and it was quite exciting watching the television over every day of the summer holidays as Ofqual came out, and then the department came out, and then Ofqual came out again. And finally, it came so late and caused so much unnecessary distress that sadly it seemed to symbolise the way this government has approached the whole of the COVID crisis. Tragically, many students decided to defer, which means universities will be in a terrible place this time in a year, because they will once again have to turn down certain students, because when you have a large number of students who defer their university place for a year, the poor university then has a lot of applicants that it has to process, and inevitably some people will miss out. This endless pattern of incompetence is no way to run the country. Young people deserve to know how they came to be let down so badly, and the 17-year-olds just embarking on their final year of A-levels or BTECs need to know that it won't happen again. And I briefly want to comment on today's announcement, because we've got the Minister here, Mr Stringer. I promised to be 30 seconds just to say that could he please get the poor teachers around the table. They desperately want to discuss the proposals in today's announcement. Don't just try and impose it from the top, because what we need to see is that pupils are treated fairly, and that able pupils in schools shouldn't just reflect the cohort from the year before, but they should be taken seriously, and that the concept of these exams needs to take allowance for the fact that some students may feel so nervous about sitting in an exam which they've missed so much preparation for that they may drop the more difficult subjects which they are capable of doing, thereby missing out on good university places which, as always, will go to the same students as they seem to every year. Let's try and fight this with a genuine vision of how we can allow students to be socially mobile and allow those who are able to really get those places at the good universities. Thank you, Mr Stringer.
Thank you, Mr Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to speak in this very timely debate. I think one point that we can all agree is that students have had an incredibly tough time this year. And the petitions we're debating today raise several important questions about exams next year. I think the government's announcement today, I think it's fair to say, represents some baby steps in the right direction, but we are left asking, where are the serious actions that will help stop a repeat of the fiasco that we saw this summer? So far, the government's answer is to delay the school exams by 3 weeks next summer to give students more time for study. But if those exams can't go ahead, then plan B is to push the schools to perform rigorous mock exams, that's a quote, many months earlier in order to provide more data to determine grades. This is incredibly half-baked. Today, students and teachers have met these measures with at best scepticism and at worst derision. How can you push back school exams by 3 weeks in order to give more time for teaching, but then basically bring them forward by 5 months by formalising mock exams? Most mocks will take place early next year, and many students and teachers now feel that they will have very little time to cover this year's syllabus before this date, making a mockery of the government's measures to give more teaching time. I would like the Minister today to give a firm commitment that no student will be tested on any subject which they have not learnt. That is absolutely vital. I would like the Minister to explain why it is that mocks are now being used in this way, because the government had dropped the idea of using mocks before, so I think it's important that people understand what has changed. I would also like to ask the Minister to explain how time will be provided to make sure that marking is done after the full exams. And this brings us to the issue of the second petition, which asks for the curriculum to be reduced as teaching time is likely to be lost due to disruption. Students have lost at least 5 months of in-school teaching, and I think many are right to be concerned that we may see some of the mistakes of this year repeated. Where there is increased interruption in teaching, we should give schools and teachers more input into these decisions, into which areas of the curriculum should be prioritised. As other honourable members have said, many teachers are saying today that they were not consulted on today's announcement, and they do want to discuss it. Will the Minister make a commitment today that he will indeed meet with them very soon? But there are, of course, wider issues at play. Schools are now warning that they may grind to a halt without access to COVID tests and without quick turnaround times for results. And for those who do have to self-isolate, many still don't have the resources and funding they need to provide education from home. This is all the worse for children with special educational needs and disabilities. Today's announcement is unbelievably thin. It could have been made weeks ago. Where is the independent assessment of what went wrong? Where is the scenario planning for next year Saying it will come later in the autumn is not good enough. The government has had months to sort this out. And what about our most vulnerable children? Those who are clinically vulnerable, for example, who are facing a life or death decision about whether they can return to school. When can we expect a comprehensive plan to all of these various challenges? Students, parents and teachers, Mr Chair, are sick of the government passing the buck. They're sick of the government letting civil servants take the hit. Ofcol was not on the ballot paper last December. The Conservative Party was. It is this government that is accountable to the public, both for what went wrong and for how they're going to fix it. Thank you.
Claudia Webb.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I would also like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Gower for securing this very important debate. I'm proud that around 250 Leicester East residents were amongst the 300,000 plus people who signed this petition calling on the government to improve the allocation of grades during the coronavirus pandemic. It's important for all of us to actually keep in mind that pupils will carry these qualifications with them their entire lives. We cannot allow young people in Leicester East, across Leicester and across the UK to be punished because of circumstances beyond their control. Yet there are widespread concerns that the system described by Ofcol as the fairest possible in the circumstances could be unfair for groups including disadvantaged pupils, African, Asian and minority ethnic pupils, children who are looked after and, as has been said, children with free school meals and pupils with special educational needs and disability. Ofcol must urgently identify where these groups have been systematically disadvantaged by calculated grades. If this is the case, Ofcol's standardisation model must adjust the grades of the pupils affected upwards. So we know that research by University College Union found that pupils from low-income families are more likely to have their grades incorrectly predicted compared to more affluent peers. High-attaining disadvantaged pupils are even more likely to be unpredicted compared to those from more affluent backgrounds. Research by the Sutton Trust concluded that 1,000 high-achieving disadvantaged students have their grades underpredicted per year. And tragically, racial inequalities exist alongside class discrimination at every stage of the education system. Research by the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills found that Black, African and African Caribbean A-level students had the lowest predicted grade accuracy, with only 39% of predicted grades accurate, whilst their white counterparts had the highest at 53%. Therefore, amid the coronavirus crisis, it is likely that the cancellation of A-levels will have a disproportionately negative impact on Black students, and the government therefore must urgently work with Ofcol to ensure that students are not discriminated against because of their background. It is crucial that pupils are able to appeal their grade if they believe that bias or discrimination has occurred. Worryingly, research into grade prediction accuracy for university applicants has found that just 16% of applicants received the grades they were predicted. Yet I'm concerned that Ofcol has not given enough thought on how this route is accessible to all pupils. Without support, proving bias or discrimination would be an almost impossible threshold for any pupil to evidence. Disadvantaged pupils and those without family resources or wider support risk being shut out of this process. And I believe the government, working with Ofcom, must urgently publish the evidence thresholds for proving bias and discrimination. They also must set out what evidence will be required and how the government will support students throughout the appeals process. Before I finish, I would just like to take this opportunity to send my solidarity to the Year 12 A-level students in Leicester and across the country who have taken strike action over the government's failure to provide adequate support to their cohort during the pandemic. To quote Aisha, one of the strike organisers from Leicester, the government have not done enough to support the future of this country. And I could not agree more. 2/3 of the current cabinet were privately educated, yet they systematically deny working-class young people, especially from African, Asian and minority ethnic communities, the opportunities that they were afforded. The government must urgently adopt a fairer means of allocating grades to ensure that no one is unjustly left behind as a result of this pandemic. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Education has changed dramatically since the COVID pandemic. I am a former secondary school teacher too, and I feel deeply concerned for the disruption, challenges and stresses which teaching staff, school leader and especially our young people had to go through and continue to face. Our teachers, school staff, pupils, their families and carers in Bath and indeed across the country have done a truly amazing job, and I do want to thank them all. The exam results chaos caused great distress and disruption that could have been completely avoided. The government, more worried about grade inflation than fairness, let thousands of young people down. And as I said at the time, teachers are far better judges of their pupils' ability than algorithms imposed by the Department for Education. Many young people's aspirations and plans for their future were dashed. Once again, and we have heard this afternoon already, it was students from disadvantaged backgrounds who were disproportionately affected. Today, Mr. Stringer, the government has announced that it will bring back exams in 2021 with a 3-week delay. I believe it is the wrong decision, and I'm saying that after actually this afternoon I have engaged with school leaders in Bath. And I trust them and I respect them for everything they say and do in Bath. We have seen that teacher assessments works, and for the next academic year, this is clearly the best option. And while the honourable member from Stoke North did not want to take any interruptions, I was going to ask him what lessons from Germany we should learn. And I'm always a little bit interested that people speak with great confidence about other countries without necessarily possibly knowing the details. Germany doesn't have any national exams. It has a devolved education system, and indeed many exam grades are being awarded through teachers' assessments. So it puts very much the point that teachers know best, and we can actually rely very solidly on teachers' assessments of their pupils. And therefore, I believe we should look at this clearly as the best option for next year at least. Many learners are still catching up. The help announced in June for learners from disadvantaged backgrounds has been delayed, and in some cases are still not in place. The education of all young people is constantly in danger of being disrupted. As soon as a group or a cohort has to self-isolate due to an outbreak, young learners find themselves back at home. Those who are due to sit the exams next year already worry that the mock exams might end up counting as the actual results. This adds another layer of stress that teachers and pupils do not deserve. We need to remember that behind every exam result is a young life full of promise. We cannot begin to know what toll the A-level and GCSE results fiasco will ultimately take on the self-esteem, mental health, personal development and earning capacity of those who have been impacted. And therefore, on behalf of students and teachers of Bath, I am calling for the government to bring back teacher assessment for 2021. It is simply not realistic to assume that we can return back to business as usual for this academic year. And I want to make another point very quickly. It is also true for Ofsted inspection. I understand that Ofsted inspections are due to resume in January. Schools are simply not ready for this. Many schools have finely tuned social distances arrangements in place. The additional presence of inspectors at the school, not normally part of the school community, adds extra worry and anxiety. How should school plan for this? Is it right that schools would have to have an extra contingency plan in case of an unexpected inspection to add to their already stretched capacity? And I hope that the government is considering this too and will put Ofsted inspections back to at least September 2021. As cases rise, so too does the risk of local and even national lockdowns. Pupils may not have seen the last of home learning. In this eventuality, government must support all schools to deliver high-quality education to every child in this country, give schools the space they need, and trust teachers and school leaders to be the best judges of their young people under their responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer.
It's a pleasure to serve under you in the chair, and I want to start by opening and thank the 551 petitioners from my constituent who has signed both of the petitions in York Central. Our young people have shown extraordinary resilience as they've battled the traumas of the last 6 months, not least when they were presented with this mutant algorithm which downgraded so many of their expectations after such extensive work that they and their teachers provided. And as my honourable friend, the member for Gower, rightly said, it is so important to listen to not only pupils but teachers as well. And not only is she a rugby player of excellence, but I think the way she tackled this debate, the Minister should surely step out the way and listen to what she had to say. Sadly, for too many, this upheaval continues as infection rates soar and getting to university in the place of their choice, now finding themselves locked down, isolated, and not knowing what comes next. Young people really need a clear plan to see them through this year securely, and government need to come up with that plan now. One thing that this summer has done is put a real spotlight on our whole education system. The inequality has been exposed, and if we think particularly about pupils who took the BTEC line of assessment, they had such a delay in waiting for their results to come forward, real inequality that came through for them. It has also demonstrated that the reliance on a single form of assessment, the exam, at such a time has created such significant risk. And I particularly want to ask the Minister why, when he knew about this inequality that was coming through, as my parliamentary question exposed, did he still go ahead and publish those results and not hold off and put the corrections in the system? It could have removed a lot of the trauma and stress which our young people had to experience this summer. Now, the catch-up support which the government promised has not arrived, the COVID catch-up programme and the national tutoring programme, partly because they're trying to procure a national contract with some private organisations. We know how well that's gone with testing, when local authorities themselves have got the relationships, the means to deliver this, and also know the needs of local schools. And I suggest to the Minister that he moves that support into local authorities, as York is asking for, and clearly the excellence of York's education system is well known, and enable the local authorities to deliver that into schools. Now, that would be a first step forward. But to believe in the announcement today that 6 months catch-up can be achieved with a 3-month extension to 3-week extension to exams is just unreal. Further episodes of isolation are continuing as we speak. This morning I was told how a constituent due to sit exams this week has had to isolate for the second time this term, resulting in 3 weeks of absence in this half-term alone. How can she fairly be assessed against her peers who have been in school perhaps the whole time, or perhaps a pupil who has been shielding at home because they're extremely clinically vulnerable? Today in York, 50 more pupils from just one secondary school have been sent home to isolate. We know that this is going to be a very disruptive year, and yet the scenario planning which we would have expected by now from the government hasn't been forthcoming, and the government really do need to recognise the reality of the situation. I trust that the Minister in his summing up will let us know exactly when we will hear what the future holds for these young people. We cannot get to the end of the year and then see some isolating when exams are due, young people already stressed today, even more stressed by the time it gets to that point in the calendar. And therefore, we need to build in the flexibility into the system now. Now, I support the call from the trade unions and others saying that we need to have a broader choice of questions in the exam papers so young people can make those options as to which questions they can answer, because we're not going to get all the content into this year, and I would be interested in the Minister's views on that. But also to have a broader assessment process, properly moderated, planned for, not like it was last year, to make sure it can accommodate. If we are honest in this room, exams are a crude assessment tool. For some people, and I'm glad to hear about the honourable member who exams were the solution to showing his academic prowess, but for other people, we certainly know that isn't the case. And therefore, how in a few hours can we really assess the whole learning journey of an individual? There are different people that respond in different ways to assessments, and I believe that we really need to see how young people can thrive through the assessment process and show off their capabilities, not least when their future currently depends on the exam as the only tool. The acquisition of knowledge is so important. Understanding how you navigate yourself through this complex world with the necessary skills to chart your course to accomplish your goal is the value of education. However, if we never get to enjoy the journey, mature as a person, gain confidence and gain the application of the tools required, then what has been achieved through our education? A hybrid assessment tool of moderated assessment, project work, problem-solving challenges, assignment and exams would stretch pupils further, but also assess people's broad range of skills and not just rely on those or benefit those who exceed exams. And while we're also seeing at the moment recovery curriculums being put in place in some schools, it is not universal, and I would ask the Minister that with more attention is paid to that. I do welcome that some of the schools, and I believe even Eton is doing this, at putting in things like farming and arts into the curriculum, and yet so many of our state schools just don't have that opportunity. If it benefits those kids, it should benefit all kids, and that's what we should be looking at. Now, while mastering data management and league tables may be important to government, our young people's mental health is more stressed than ever before, and we've heard that throughout this debate today. If we are serious about developing confident, well-rounded young people and building an economy fit for the future, improving productivity and being world leaders again, we should be equipping our young people with a curriculum that really helps all of our young people soar and not stumble. Knowledge is one thing, but skills to know how to research and critically appraise information is of far greater value, and therefore we should redress the assessment system again, because before an exam paper, some people thrive and some people dive. Education must therefore be about stretching young minds, challenging, providing young people the opportunity to show off their gifts and talents to shape our future. Let's not crush this opportunity in an exam, particularly at a time when there are so many unknowns in the equation. Let's really reward our young people with the right assessment tools so they can have confidence in their learning now and in the assessment to come at the end of the year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I want to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Gower, for securing this debate. This issue has affected thousands of our constituents, and I thank the over 1,000 of my constituents who supported both of these petitions. And of course, the teachers, the other workers within the school system, and everybody that's played a part in keeping our young people safe while as they returned to school. And this has happened, Mr. Stringer, despite the government, I would argue, and despite the government failing to prepare for the summer, and despite warnings from education unions, from parents, from members of parliament across different parties. And the fiasco over the summer has demonstrated a level of incompetence that frankly beggars belief. And I hope that the Minister, with his colleagues, will make sure that lessons are learned from what happened and what went wrong. And it is not enough just to blame the institutions, Ofqual and others, and not take responsibility. Frankly, if politicians are going to blame those institutions, they ought to make sure that ministers are responsible, because ultimately it is down to ministerial responsibility what happens. And teachers, students and their families have faced nothing but anxiety all the way through to the exam period and then through the summer. The Education Secretary had his head buried in the sand, and the reactive, make-it-up-as-you-go-along approach to handling this crisis over the summer, along with others, has damaged young people's future, and it has left many wondering what's going to happen, many parents wondering what's going to happen to their children. In my constituency, where 55% of children live below the poverty line, the government, while promising that young people will be given laptops and support, Many have not received the help they need. Many young people who suffer disabilities haven't had the help that they desperately need up and down the country. And that's no different in constituencies like mine. And it's really important that the Minister addresses the question about getting the help and the kit that young people need that they haven't received. And I'd be grateful if the Minister can provide some facts on how many young people still are to receive those. Because the reports are in constituencies like mine, they do not have the laptops. They're not getting the internet access they need. That would make a big difference. The findings of the FFT Education Data Lab has shown that kids from disadvantaged schools are now 22% behind those from advantaged schools. And there's a big differential in terms of the impact of on ethnic minority young people. They are significantly worse off. Those who are SEND, in the SEND category, who have special needs, need much more help. And I hope the Minister will address this point as well. And many honourable friends have mentioned the issue related to schools getting results based on the results of previous years. And that is a massive problem. In my own constituency, I came across a number of cases. In one case, one student received 3 U grades, 3 unclassified grades, when his predicted grades were 2 A's and a B. That is nothing to do with him and to do with the algorithm basing those judgments, basing those results on past exam results. There is an inherent problem with that. There needs to be an inquiry on what went wrong. It is scandalous that the government chose a system that basically discriminated between private schools and state schools, minority ethnic groups, and also between social classes, ultimately. That is shocking. Nobody ever thought that could happen in this day and age. And we must learn the lessons from what went wrong and make sure that doesn't happen. And I hope that the Minister will not only give us assurances, but today demonstrate precisely how he's going to ensure this doesn't happen again. The National Foundation for Educational Research has found that while the average learning loss was 3 months for all pupils, it is 4 months for children from BAME backgrounds. Mr. Stringer, we've seen the differential impact on different groups. Poorer families have been worse off by this crisis, both economically as well as the health pandemic and its impact. We've seen the differential impact on BAME communities. We've seen the impact, as others have said, on those with disabilities, particularly children. We need the government to put in special initiatives to support those groups that have been hit very hard. That is surely something we can all agree on, whatever our analysis is of what's happened over the summer. The fact is that we need to ensure that young people are not condemned by what has happened in terms of this pandemic, that their future is protected. And what's happened this year was unavoidable. Lessons could have been learned. Action could have been taken faster. The final point I wanted to make was about test and trace. We need to make sure that that is working properly. I've got reports from schools in my constituency where whole year groups are being sent home because test and trace is not adequate enough, and that cannot be good for ensuring young people are able to get the education that they deserve and need. So the government needs to get a grip on that, otherwise it's going to get worse, and during the exam period it's going to be an even bigger problem. Mr. Stringer, I'm going to conclude my remarks because I'm conscious that the front bench need to come in, but I hope that the Minister will have clear answers and be able to give assurances to our constituents to make sure that the lessons are learnt and that there is an inquiry into what went wrong, so that we've got a proper line of sight on what went wrong, and the government can be held to account properly to make sure that young people get a better outcome next year when they've got exams coming up. Thank you.
Margaret East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stringer, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Gower, on securing this really important debate, and we've had some really important contributions from members. So the member for Gower gave an excellent speech grounded in the realities faced by pupils and teachers, and called on the government to listen to their voices. And she quite rightly said that clarity is paramount for everybody involved. The member for Bexhill and Battle called for the government to look at coursework marked by exam boards to be considered. The member for Slough spoke very eloquently on the confusion and chaos the government presided over this year, and the heartbreaking stories of university places being withdrawn. He also set out how students from disadvantaged backgrounds were most likely to be adversely affected and that ministers were responsible for hard-baking disadvantage into the system. The member for Barnsley East spoke passionately of the injustice visited on her constituents as a result of the government's discriminatory actions, and the member for Hornsey and Wood Green expressed her concerns about the impact government actions would have on students' subject choice. The member for York Central paid tribute to pupils who've shown extraordinary resilience this year, and she spoke of the injustice visited on BTEC students who had to face such long delays in receiving their results. The member for Bethnal Green and Bow set out quite clearly that the incompetence shown by government over the summer beggars belief and that they should learn from their mistakes. And she spoke very eloquently about the disadvantage that children in her constituency face. The petitions that we've been debating today have both received almost 150,000 signatures, so it is very clear that these are issues of immense public interest. The government has presided over a summer of chaos, incompetence and confusion, and their failure to effectively manage the exams and assessments processes for summer 2020 caused enormous anxiety to many children and young people, as well as their families and teachers. There were problems from the beginning with the way in which the government decided that pupils' grades would be calculated. According to Ofqual, ministers were repeatedly warned about this. At a meeting of the Education Select Committee in September, Julie Swan, Executive Director of General Qualifications to Ofqual, said the regulator provided advice to ministers on the 16th of March of this year that it would be challenging, if not impossible, to attempt to moderate estimated grades in a way that is fair for all of this year's students. She went on to say everyone throughout the process was aware of the risks, and she referred to a paper of the General Public Sector Ministerial Implementation Group on 1st of May, which highlighted the risk of widespread dissatisfaction with grades awarded from individual students, schools and colleges, and the risk to public confidence. She said that Ofqual briefed number 10 on the 7th of August and held regular meetings throughout this period with the schools minister. After days of confusion following A-level results on the 13th of August, when nearly 40% of students' centre-assessed grades were adjusted downwards, the Secretary of State finally listened to young people, their parents, their teachers and the Labour Party and allowed centre-assessed grades to be used. Labour tried through an Opposition Day debate and a vote on the floor of the House to get the government to be open and transparent about what ministers knew and when they knew it, and what they did about it when they were warned of the difficulties. Full disclosure of this from government would have at least enabled students, their families and teachers to see what went wrong and why it went wrong. While Conservative MPs voted the motion down, the government's chaotic handling of the exams process really dented confidence in our examination system. And there are now, of course, questions about what happens next summer and beyond. Petition 320772 called on the government to reduce curriculum content for Year 10 and 12 students who will sit exams next year. It argued that the loss of classroom-based learning cannot effectively be compensated for by provided remote learning activities, and that by reducing the content, students will have the opportunity to sit their exams equitably. In August, Labour called for A-level and GCSE exams in 2021 to be pushed back to June to give pupils a better chance to catch up on lost teaching time. On the 1st of September, the Secretary of State indicated the government would indeed be implementing a delay to exams. Then there was a long period of silence from the department. What was the government doing when it should have been providing much-needed clarity to teachers and students about assessment for 2021? The silence lasted for 5.5 weeks until just 2 days ago, on the 10th of October, when press reports suggested the Secretary of State was expected to announce a 3-week delay in the start of next summer's exams, alongside a requirement for schools to hold mock exams in controlled conditions earlier in the year with exam-style invigilating, marking and grading. According to those reports, the mock grades could then be used to assess results in regions or centres where pupils' exam preparations have been severely disrupted by coronavirus outbreaks, or in the event of them being unable to sit some of their exams in the summer. The government's announcement today about the exams for next summer, along with the press reports, raise a number of questions. So can the Minister say why speculative reports about next year's exams appeared in the press before an official announcement was made? Why has it taken the government almost half of the first school term to come up with this statement? Can the Minister elaborate on reports in the press referring to tensions between the department and Ofqual? And will the Minister set out the full range of options for next summer's exams presented to the department by Ofqual? The Government has also announced that they will engage widely with the sector over the next 6 weeks to identify any risks to exams at national, local and individual student level and consider measures needed to address any potential disruption. This is really quite remarkable. What has the Government been doing and why hasn't it been doing this already? Students and teachers really can't wait any longer for the clarity that they need. And yet today, as the leaves outside are turning golden brown, the Government is telling them that more detail will be published later in the autumn. Precisely when during this season does the Minister have in mind? The incompetence of this Government is breathtaking. We need a Government that is able to plan effectively for next year. We don't know how much more school-based teaching time may be lost. However, what we do know is that it's likely that any such loss is likely to be different in schools and different between different cohorts of pupils. A group of head teachers who wrote to me last week highlighted that very point. They said substantial adjustments excuse me, need to be made at a subject level that will ensure those... Excuse me. Sorry about that. Those in areas of the country that have been most badly affected by the virus are not further disadvantaged by an assessment process that assumes that the problems experienced have been spread equally. So what plans does the Government have to address this? As the member for Lewisham, West and Penge has pointed out, 5 education unions have come up with a proposal of awarding GCSE, AS and A-level grades in 2021. Together, the ASCL, the NAHT, the NASUWT, the NEU and the NGA have set out a series of recommendations which include to commission an independent review of what happens this year in order to learn from this when planning for what to do next year, and to publish contingency plans as soon as possible to outline how students who are unable to sit exams in the summer or whose education has been very significantly disrupted will nevertheless receive robust, reliable grades next year. What assessment has the Government made of the Union's recommendations? To conclude, today's announcement could have been made weeks ago. The consultation that the Government now says it will carry out with the sector over the next 6 weeks to consider measures needed to address any potential disruption in learning should have happened already. The Government says it will publish more detail in the autumn, saying that it will publish more detail in the autumn will not give students and teachers reassurance. It will make them anxious that they now have to wait even longer for answers from this Government.
Marginally more time than we expected. If you could ensure that there's 2 or 3 minutes left for a wind-up. Minister.
Mr Stringer, it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and also a pleasure to respond to the debate initiated by the Honourable Member for Gower, and I congratulate her on both securing this debate and on the way she introduced it. Coronavirus has been causing huge disruption to young people and their families, to schools and to the wider teaching community. This Government has always made the education of young people a priority, and as we all continue to adapt and progress through the pandemic, we are determined to make sure that when the time comes, young people are able to take the next step in their lives with the skills and qualifications that they need. At the same time, we must do whatever we can to reduce the pressure on all those who are studying at school or college during what is an incredibly stressful time. And as many members in this debate have said, too much teaching time has been lost over the past few months, and we are determined that we cannot risk any child's education being put on hold. Today's announcement of a 3-week delay is only one component designed to increase teacher time and help students to catch up. The changes proposed by Ofqual to the assessment process and the £1 billion catch-up fund are also part of that process. Now, with regard to summer 2020, I should stress that I understand very clearly that the whole situation around grading caused a great deal of stress and uncertainty. Both the Education Secretary and I understand the distress this has caused young people and their parents. We never wanted to cancel exams. They are obviously the best and fairest form of assessment, but we had to take the difficult decision to close schools and colleges and cancel summer exams because of the Covid-19 outbreak. We were in uncharted territory in devising an alternative system. The overriding aim was to ensure that all students received just recognition for their efforts and were able to progress to the next stage of their lives, in the knowledge that their qualifications have the same value as in previous years. We worked closely with, I won't give way for the moment, I'll give way later on if I may. We worked closely with the independent qualifications regulator, Ofqual, as they developed the process for arriving at calculated grades through a standardisation model. But it became clear that the model was throwing up far too many inconsistent and unfair outcomes for students that may not have reflected their hard work or ability. It was not reasonable to expect these all to be dealt with through an appeal system, and they severely undermined public confidence in the system. Therefore, Ofqual and the government took immediate action. We announced on the 17th of August the decision to revert to centre assessment grades for all students, or the calculated grade where this was higher. This was the best outcome in the very difficult circumstances which we were in, and fairest for students and their families. GCSE results were recalculated on this basis, and results returned to schools on time and within 48 hours of that decision being made. And A-level results were also recalculated and reissued. I give way to the honourable member.
And he said that, that students should receive the fairest grade. Does he accept that 63% of pupils in Barnsley had their grades, they had them downgraded? That's compared to 40% nationally. Many private schools saw their grades go up. And he said they acted quickly. They could see this happening in Scotland. They didn't anticipate, they didn't take action, and they waited days. And this has genuinely affected, many hundreds of thousands of young people's future. And we need to make sure it does not happen again.
And that's why the decision was taken on the 17th of August to revert to calculated grades and to centre assessment grades or calculated grades, which were ever the highest. And it's also why, one of the reasons why, we determined that exams will go ahead this year. They are the fairest system. As my honourable friend, the member for Bexhill and Battle said, they are the fairest system of assessing pupils' ability and the work that they have done in the 2 years of their course. Now, our priority now is to ensure that next year's exams proceed fairly and efficiently, and that students receive the qualifications they deserve. And that is the view of the teacher and head teacher unions, including, I'll say to the Honourable Member for Gower, including the NEU, as expressed in their letter to the Department on the 2nd of October, which I will quote from. It says, "The government is right, in our view, to pursue Plan A, which would enable all students to sit exams in summer 2021. Students in Year 11 and Year 13 are already more than halfway through their courses and must be enabled to complete those courses." And they went on to say that as these qualifications are mainly designed to be assessed by final examination, it is right that these exams should go ahead if possible. I'll give way to the honourable member. No, you weren't. Okay, I thought you were.
Can the Minister just use some of his time to explain what the contingency plans are in the event that testing and tracing isn't as effective as it needs to be and that exams are disrupted? What is the contingency plan? What's Plan B?
Well, we are working, Mr Stringer, with Ofqual on viable assessment options based on a number of different scenarios, and we'll share further details of those in good time. We have asked Ofqual to support the government in developing these arrangements, engaging closely with the schools and colleges and teachers and exam boards, and unions and universities. And the results of this planning are ongoing, as are those discussions, and once we reach a conclusion, we will publish those results. And while the honourable member has intervened, I just wanted also to respond to her issue she raised during the debate about remote education. And whilst, of course, the vast majority of children are back in school, if face-to-face education is disrupted, we have made 250,000 laptops available, building on over 220,000 laptops already delivered to those in need. And we've also made resources available to deliver online education. We're funding the Oak National Academy, which is providing hundreds of online lessons for schools, and also providing webinars and guidance to teachers about how to deliver remote education in the most effective way. Now, Mr Stringer, we have been working... I'll give way to that. Then I'm going to try and finish.
He's extremely generous. Would he accept that it is so difficult, particularly for FE colleges, where many students are on a very reduced income, to pay themselves for internet access or for devices? It's very hard to write an essay on a mobile phone. And what does he propose to do in those cases?
Well, as the Secretary of State said today, there is more flexibility in bursaries that are available to be used for those purposes. Now, we have been working continuously with the exams regulator, Ofqual, the exam boards, and groups representing teachers, schools and colleges on the best approach to exams and assessment in 2021. We will continue to work together to ensure that exams take place next year, but we recognise that students continue to experience disruption to their education because of Covid-19, and we need to take account of that, and we are doing. So in July, Ofqual consulted on a range of possible adaptations to GCSE, AS and A-level exams and assessments next year on a subject-by-subject basis, with the overriding priority of ensuring that exams and assessments are fair. The consultation proposed, in particular, a range of ways to free up additional teaching time, including the possibility of a slight delay to the exam's timetable, which we've now, of course, announced, and to accommodate any public health requirements next year. On the 3rd of August, Ofqual published its decisions on the changes proposed in the consultation, and these include changes to assessments in some subjects, for example, removing the requirement to record the spoken language assessment in GCSE English language and allowing GCSE students to observe rather than undertake practical science work. In some subjects with a high volume of content, for example, GCSE history and ancient history and English literature, Ofqual confirmed that exam boards should change how they assess students next year by allowing a choice of topics in the exams. These changes will reduce pressure on teachers and students in the next academic year. Individually, some of the changes may appear modest, but we believe they will have a significant impact when combined across subjects, and then when combined, of course, with the 3-week delay, and when combined with the £1 billion catch-up fund. As with this year, the most important principle is that students due to sit exams and assessments next summer should be enabled to progress successfully to the next stage of education or employment. Each of these elements of content that forms the foundation for GCSE, AS and A-level qualification is important. And whilst the government was clear that the content of GCSEs and A-levels will not be changed in 2021, allowing a choice of topics in certain subjects with a high volume of content will release teaching time and support students and their schools and colleges. And as the Education Secretary has confirmed, there will be no further subject-level changes to exams and assessments this year, and this confirmation gives teachers and school leaders and pupils clarity on what will be assessed in the exams next summer. Now, in the time available, I just wanted to touch on the issue raised by my honourable friend, the member for Bexhill and Battle, and he was right to raise this issue of lost teaching time, and we recognise that students, including those who sit exams next year, will have experienced disruption, and that's why I've said we have the £1 billion, and also for 16 to 19, we have the tuition fund allocating up to £96 million for disadvantaged students from that fund. So, Mr. Stringer, in the time available, I will just conclude to say that our approach next year will ensure that young people can prepare for exams with confidence and receive the extra teaching time and support that students need to enable them to do their best in the exam so they can progress onto the next stage of their education.
Tonia Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank the Minister for his response and say that I actually took my comments from an immediate email that was received from the NEU this afternoon, so for correction. And to actually just to point out a couple of things. I know that the petitioners, Jakia Ali and Rafia Hussain, will be very pleased that we have discussed this today and they have seen some action, maybe not exactly what they wanted, but to say to the Honourable Member from Bexhill and Battle, my son would have done better if he'd have sat the exams as well, I'm sure. I think it's a learning style and exams are important, but we are in a pandemic and that is what we have to remember. It is important that we have a contingency, and I feel that I do not... The feeling of this petition was not to have a go at the private educational system. What it was is to call for transparency and equality across all education, and we saw that that didn't happen this summer, and we must, and the government has to, ensure that that does not happen again. And also, where does the buck stop? Mr Stringer, the buck stops with the government, not with Ofqual. It stops with the government. Thank you very much.
This House has considered e-petition 306-773 and 3207-72 relating to exams during Covid-19. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am suspending the House for 2 minutes. Honourable members, remember to exit that far door.